Good morning, good afternoon, good evening from wherever you are in the world. My name is Jessica, and this Kiwi read even more books than last month. So strap in, grab yourself a cup of coffee, and I'll see you soon. This wrap up is going to be separate from the TBR video that I do this month, and that is because I read 13 books this month. How did I do that? I have no idea. But in order to keep this moving, I've split this up into sections so it won't be all over the place. Give me some reading love by hitting that like and subscribe button, and let's get into my January wrap up. So for Buzzwordathon, the prompt for January was to read a book with the word there in it, and that could be any iteration of the word. And I chose to read They're Watching You by Chelsea Acheso. Boy, did we start off strong with that one. It follows Marin, who's investigating the disappearance of her best friend and roommate in college. And in doing so, she becomes part of a secret society within that college in which they play games in order to rise through the ranks. Akeso did a great job at keeping you guessing through the whole story, and even I didn't see the ending coming. But she keeps it going with lots of tension, lots of guessing, lots of banter throughout the whole thing. And the clues were there for the ending the whole time, but you just didn't see it until you knew what was happening, and then everything just kind of fell into place. It does lose a point with some of the dialogue. I found it a little bit whiny, a little bit young for what I think she was trying to achieve, but it is absolutely a solid 4-star, and I will definitely reread it. So TBRathon, as I've talked about before, was a readathon that was hosted by Leandra from Leandra the TBR Zero, and there were several games that you could play. I chose the bingo board because it was straightforward, and I went straight down the middle of the red path. I also used They're Watching You for this one, and I used that for two of the prompt, newest borrow and a new to you author. And because double ups were allowed, I decided to use it for both of them. The next book that I read for the TBRathon was Starling House, which fulfilled the prompt of a character and the name of a character in the title. And Starling House follows a girl who gets a cleaning job starting at Starling House. And this is a mysterious mansion that is full of personality, that has a rich and dark history behind it. And within the town of Eden, where this is set, the history is never quite clear because everyone has a different story and it's slightly changed every time. You also get the perspective of the current occupant and owner of Starling House, who is a watcher, and his name is Arthur Starling, hence the name of the character in the title. And his job is to fight the evils that come from the house and keep it from the town. So the house itself, I felt like, was a character, and it was, for me, more full of personality than the main characters. It was responding really well. There were nails that were creaking, that were being pulled up by themselves. There were doors that would just open, and it was quite whimsical and fun, and sentient houses just work for me. The whimsy and the mysterious writing and the artwork throughout the pages is what really carried the story for me. And it makes up for the one-dimensional human characters that are in it, and in my opinion, a boring climax. And because of this, I rated it 4 stars. So the final book I read for TBRathon was the next in a series, and I chose to reread Akamath, A Court of Mist and Fury, which is the second book in the Court of Thorns and Roses series by Sarah J. Maas. I'm sure everyone knows what the ACOTAR series is, but if you don't, the quick rundown of it is it follows Feyre, who's a human, and she gets taken to Prythian, which is the Fey lands, because she killed a fairy. And while the first book follows her getting to know the land and building a relationship with Tamlin of the Spring Court, the second book follows a much bigger plot line. It opens the reader up to just how big the world is. There's exploration of the Night Court, of the Hewn City, of the Summer Court. Of course, there's more of the Spring Court, and it becomes a much bigger plot than just a girl who is struggling to find her way in these lands where she doesn't belong. This is absolutely my favorite book in the series, and it obviously gets a 5 star from me. It hasn't changed since the last time I read it, and I'm still in love with it. So the free space meant that you didn't need to read a book for that one. You could, but you didn't have to, so I chose not to. Leandra, if you watch this, please correct me if I'm wrong, and in that case I'll just double up one of the ones that I read. So for Bookemon, and strap in because this is going to be a long one, there are several different prompts that I was able to complete, as well as getting the themed Pokemon and the monthly Pokemon. And so for January, the themed Pokemon was to complete the TBRathon and complete at least one of their game boards, which I did with the bingo board. And so I got a gold coin to lure out that Pokemon. And so the monthly prompt for January was to read a children's book of any size within the month of January, and that could be either a board book or a picture book, could be a chapter book, as long as it was a children's book. It could take a minute to read. As long as you read it within January, then you would get the monthly Pokemon. And I chose to read Tales from Everywhere from Janet Graham Johnson. If you read my first book haul, it was given to me for my birthday from my mum when she had it from she was a little girl, and so I decided to read that for this prompt, and it was a beautiful book. The illustrations are gorgeous, the stories were gorgeous, and each tale had their own lessons in them that could be learnt and discussed with children. For example, keeping promises or not being selfish. This one's quite hard to rate because it was only 50 pages, and because of how many stories there was, I didn't really feel attached to anyone in particular. The stories were well written, and I think I could imagine them being the right length for a children's attention span. However, I feel like some of the language that was used was a bit more grown up than a child might not understand. Maybe an older child would be fine with it, but a younger child, not so much. And I rated this a 3.75. And so there are other seasonal prompts which require 2 either books or other lifestyle things to do in order to unlock the Bookemon. And one of them, which I read this month, was The Telescope, which was to read a book with the night sky on the cover. Editing Jess here. I'm going to change this to the Christmas tree prompt, which is to read a book with a sparkly cover, because after looking at the cover for a while, it is not a night sky. And so I'll choose something else for that. And for this one, I read Go Hex Yourself by Jessica Clare. And this is a romance about a woman called Reggie who applies for a job that she assumes is at a card game company that she loves. Turns out that she's working for a 2,000-year-old witch and her nephew. The adventures that ensue while she's learning how to practice magic and while her energy is being drained as a familiar are actually quite surprisingly funny. This was well written as far as adding comedy into it. It was light-hearted even through the whole plot. And I feel like it's a great palate cleanser. Most of it I read yesterday, which was the 31st of January. So it's a really quick and easy read, but it was a great palate cleanser coming off a couple of the other books that I was reading through the month that were quite dense and quite hard to read. It was quite amazing just to zone out and not think about anything and just have a good time. And I'm very interested to read the sequel to this. And so for Go Hex Yourself, I rated it 4 stars. For the ant prompt, which was to read a book under 100 pages, I read the autobiography of Nikola Tesla, and that was 90 pages. And for the most part, it was pretty boring. Not gonna lie, but there were some aspects of Tesla's narration that I enjoyed and I clicked with. There was parts of it that seemed like maybe he was on the spectrum, the autistic spectrum, and I just really clicked with it. And some of the way he describes how he figured things out was really interesting. So this follows glimpses into Tesla's life, and Tesla was a man who contributed a lot of knowledge and research into electricity, television, radio, that kind of thing. I rated it 3.5 stars. For the UFO prompt, I read 400 plus book in a single day, and that was Divergent by Veronica Roth. This was 487 pages and it took me 12 hours to read. Luckily, it had relatively large margins and there weren't too many words on the page, so it was doable. I'm planning on including it in a vlog to come up when I read the other books in the series. This is a dystopian novel that follows Triss as she leaves her family in abnegation and finds a new one in the Dauntless faction, who are essentially the police or the military of this world. There are 5 factions in the world, and each of them value different qualities in higher regard. And so this is the first book in the Divergent series, and I rated it a 3.75. It was okay. A bit of nostalgia from the movies because I had watched the movies, I hadn't read the books. But I found the characters a bit one-dimensional and I didn't really care about any of them. Maybe except for Four and Eric, who I thought was pretty funny as a villain. The bed prompt was to read a book in bed. Easy enough. For this, I read Tender as the Flesh by Augustina Bazterrica. If you haven't watched my review for this book, please go ahead and do so. Um, but this follows Mako, who works in a processing plant where humans are butchered and sold for meat. And so, in this world, a virus has infected all the animals, and so it's unsafe to eat meat from animals now, and humans have now taken their place as the only meat source on the market. This was a disturbing insight into the farming and meat industry, with humans being behind the cages instead. And it's definitely not a book to read if you're a bit squeamish, if you have a bit of a light stomach for that kind of thing. I wouldn't recommend it, but for me, I quite enjoyed it. I gave it 4 stars. The magic wand prompt involves 3 prompts to be completed in as many months, so that's within 3 months. The book I read was for fairy tale retelling, and I chose A Spindle Splintered by Alex E. Harrow. And this is a novella about Zinnia, who has a terminal illness in which people don't usually survive past the age of 21. And so, because of this, she lives her life to the fullest. Like, she's 21, she's got university degrees, and she holds on to her loves like anything else. And one of those is Sleeping Beauty. And so on her 21st birthday, her best friend named Charm surprises her with a Sleeping Beauty themed birthday party, complete with a spindle. And so she pricks her finger on the spindle, and that's when all the hits the fan. She spins out, and then she wakes up in a different world, in a different realm, where another Sleeping Beauty is about to do the same, prick her finger on the spindle. Um, and so Zinnia saves her from doing that, and then it follows an adventure to save not only this Sleeping Beauty, but all the other Sleeping Beauties in the different stories. A book that was aged for the early 20s. Zinnia has a very young narration style, and I kept forgetting that she wasn't a teen or a tween. Unfortunately, this was a novella that didn't really have a lot of substance to it. I mean, it's a great palate cleanser if you're looking for one of those after some heavy books. Um, then it's absolutely the book to read. But I rated this as 3.5, and I think it would be quite hard to rate a novella much higher than that. The chicken prompt is a year-long prompt where it requires a book to have orange or yellow and black and white on the cover of a book. And so you need to read a book every month in order to get that. And so for January, I read Out of Orange by Clary Walters, and this is the memoir of the real Alex Voss from Orange is the New Black. And it follows her time before she met Piper, and while she was with Piper, with the drug smuggling, and also how she got caught in a little bit of time with her in prison and how she coped afterwards. The big surprise of this book was how much time was given to cats. She loved her cats. She had 2 cats, and she also was adopted by a cat at prison. So between her cats at home and the cat that adopted her in prison, there was a lot more about that than I really expected. It was an interesting look into Clary's life, and I would be really interested to read Piper's memoir from this, um, and see her side of the story, because obviously there's 2 sides to every story. And so I rated this 3.75 stars. For the worm prompt was to read a book with a misunderstood character, and I read the sequel to Of Stars and Tides by Lachlan Blake. And this was a beta read, so I can't talk much about this because it's not up for publication yet. But the series follows Cassie, who finds out that she's a zodiac, and she's misunderstood because she's feared or hated by some due to her ability as a Gemini. And Geminis have a very dark side to them that can come out and have been known to obliterate zodiacs in the past. But within this book, there are a few times where the darker side of her, that Gemini part of her, it actually comes in handy and it saves her life and the lives of others around her. Along the way, they're also preparing for this massive war between all of the Greek gods, and they're using the different zodiacs on the different sides. And so there's quite a lot to these books. There is both strong romance and found family elements throughout these books. It's technically a new adult fantasy. The first reads more like a YA, and the second starts finding its new adult feet. And because of this, I gave it 3.5. The fossil prompt was to read a historical fiction, and for this I read The Great Gatsby by F. Scott Fitzgerald. And this was a hard book to get through. For a book that was under 200 pages, this took me a whole week to read. I should have DNF'd it, but I'm stubborn. The description of Gatsby himself was spectacular. Like, for those few times where he was actually on page, it would just stop time for a wee while. And the character of Gatsby himself was very commanding. But for the rest of it, it was a literary drunken haze where the plot jumped around and it was hard to know where I was at some points, and it gave me a hangover. It gave me a book hangover. And so I find it quite hard to actually summarize this book because it just jumps around. I think the best way to describe it is a set of character observations where we have the narrator, who is a Mr. Caraway, who's gone along into all of these different situations, and he's essentially observing it and writing it down in a period over a summer in Long Island. I gave it 3 stars, and that was being generous. For the volcanic rock prompt, it requires 6 months of books from 6 different book clubs. Each month must be a new club or a buddy read. January saw my very first buddy read ever, and it was the best experience. I had the greatest fun. We read Piranesi by Susanna Clarke, and I suggest you watch my review for this one. It follows Piranesi, who lives in a giant labyrinthine house, and he explores it. It's written in diary format, so it's very joyous and it's also very naive. And I found it interesting to read a book with so few characters. There's maybe 4 of note throughout the whole book, and they're very sparse as well. This was a very short book. It was 272 pages. However, it was packed with rich description, feeling, and mystery, all leading up to a sinister climax. The book is entirely rereadable, and I think any reader could take different things from the book as they reread them. For this reason, it was my first 5-star of the year. So this is the point in the video which I tell you I completely failed my pulled TBR once again. To recap, I pulled The Great Gatsby, which I did read, Inkheart and Valor. I also set Ocean of Milk as the Kiwi book of the month. And I'm partway through both Babel and Ocean of Milk, and so far I am really, really enjoying both of them, and I can't wait to talk to you about them. Inkheart did not move off my shelf whatsoever. I think the lack of pulled TBR readings came from the fact that a lot of my library holds all came in all at once, quicker than I was expecting them to. And I just didn't quite prioritize that right with other books that I had to read or wanted to read through this month. So stay tuned for my next video where we're going to talk about my February TBR, but it's going to be a bit different. And that's because February is a short month and there are a lot of books that I want to read in February. And so I need to focus on prioritization of these books instead of pulling other books from the jar. There will still be a Kiwi book of the month, however. So, after all of that, if you haven't had an aneurysm because of the sheer volume of this wrap up, please remember to give this a like and subscribe if you haven't already. Your question of the day, and I'm very interested to hear this from everyone, is what is your average book count per month? Because this month was huge with the amount of books that I pulled. And I said last month that I didn't think I could beat the 9 books. But I've smashed that completely. And so I want to know what your average per month is, or do you have an average per month? And with that, I hope you enjoyed this video. It was a long one, but hopefully you found some books in there that you want to read. Have a great day or night from wherever you are in the world, and until next time, bye.